I'm CJ Thomas, and today we're going to break down the track Bloom from my new album called Landscapes. We'll dive into the origin of the piece, the overall structure, and crack open the production session to explore all of the elements that contribute to the final master. If you haven't heard Bloom yet, it's out right now, so you can go listen to it on Spotify, Apple, Tidal, or wherever you listen to music. I thought we would start this little breakdown at the piano because that's where the whole piece started. As far as piano parts go, to say that this is a simple piece is an understatement because the first chord right here is a root position C major chord, which is probably the first chord anybody learns when they start to play piano. You learn your C, E, G. Put that down the octave with a little bit of a 3/4 almost waltzy feel. The idea that I had, and this is kind of cheesy, sort of this idea of how we're born and we grow into something bigger, maybe some turmoil happens, but at the end we all die. The way the piece starts with this rocking sort of C major, it's kind of the nothingness, and then you have this sort of birth, this tiny little sprout. And I kind of wanted this feeling of drifting and sort of, we're all really meandering through life. Even if we think we know what our purpose is and what we're here for, really we're just trying to figure it out. So we're often kind of back and forth between major and minor. Now we're in minor and back to major. So that's kind of where it all started. And then there's a bit of a B section. And then from there, the melody then jumps up an octave and our chord, instead of this root position kind of closed shape, C major, then opens up to more of an open spread shape. So then we kind of come into a repeat where it's more opened up. And the only other section is this sort of bridge. You could think of it as a bridge where I think of it as the turbulence, the turmoil. Kind of comes back down. It's sort of as if the storm passes, the rough part's over, but like all of us, like every living creature, death is certain. So the whole piece ends with death. We're back to our same original melody, this simple pentatonic. But instead of playing that over the C major, now we're playing it a little bit slower, a little more funeral march over an A minor, spread down here like this. And so to me, just that accompaniment down here, that to me feels very much like a funeral march. Now that we have explored the overall concept and structure of the piece, we'll dive into the actual project session and we'll look at some of the more vertical development. So we'll break it down track by track and look at each element that made its way onto the final mix, as well as some production tricks along the way. So here we are in the actual production session for Bloom, and this is in Logic Pro. This is basically where a lot of the recording as well as the mixing happened. So what you're going to hear is the final mix before it went to the mastering engineer for mastering. So starting out with the piano is kind of ever present throughout the entire piece. Let's start by just listening to a little bit of the piano on its own. So production-wise, you can hear, first of all, it has that darker, muted, felted sound. So I did record the piano with a layer of felt in between the hammers and the strings, which is not uncommon to do, especially in this type of music. And sometimes that sound can be a little overdone, but I think especially with these Yamaha U1 uprights, it's a kind of a brighter piano. Yamahas tend to be bright anyways, and then when it's an upright, not a big, beautiful grand. For me, it's a nice way to kind of just mellow things out and get away from that honky-tonk saloon sound, which isn't necessarily what I'm going for in this case, but hey, in other pieces, maybe it is. As far as recording goes, I used 2 pairs of microphones. I used a pair of KM184 pencil condenser microphones, and those are pretty common for this kind of piano sound, and they're right on the hammers on the front of the piano. But to complement those, I pair those with probably my favorite microphones on the planet, which are the Coles 4038 ribbon microphones. They're a bit of a sort of darker, more mellow tone. And the only way I can describe it is they just have this way of capturing the soul of something. Here are just the KM184 pencil microphones. If we listen to just the Coles 4038 ribbon microphones on their own, this is what that sounds like. Rich like molasses. That to me is really capturing the sound I love to hear from a piano, that dark, woody, knocking sound. If we put the two together, now we're starting to get a more full picture of the piano with the best of both worlds. Here we are now ready to talk about the strings. And for this album, I ended up working with Clockwork Sessions. They're a studio based in Scotland, and they do everything from small soloist or small ensemble to full orchestral sections for film scores and everything in between. So very versatile, but another cool thing is they record in this old church that they converted into a purpose-built studio. So it's a bit of a bigger kind of hall sound, adds a little bit of an airiness to everything. They put together a string quartet for me. So we had the 2 violins, viola and cello, and we had 1 day to record everything for the album. We did end up doing 1 pickup session for a few other things, but it was a pretty awesome process to work with them. I would basically write the music here in San Diego, put together the scores, send it over to them, and then we would get on a remote session, and then they send me the full multi-track recordings to drop in and mix. Here's sort of the section where the strings enter. you can hear that these are humans in a room. Sometimes you hear maybe the creaking of the floor or a chair, maybe a little sort of clicking sound from the bow, kind of accidentally knocking on the edge of the instrument. And sometimes you can even hear their breathing. And I think all of these things that some people might see as imperfections, that to me is what breathes life into these recordings. It shows that we are listening to real human beings playing. And that's important to me. I mean, I've reflected a lot on some of the just most iconic recordings in history. You're not just hearing the notes and even the performances, but you're also hearing the rooms that they're in and the air around them. And I think in the age we live in now, where everybody has access to the same sample libraries and the same sort of pre-packaged instruments in the computer, a surefire way to develop more originality and really breathe life into a piece is to record real people with real microphones in real spaces. So that's something that's important to me and something that I try to focus on a lot with my music. And it's also just a lot more fun. And I know that might sound like, well, oh, you have to afford to be able to hire a studio and pay these top players, but that's not always the case. To be honest, if you look at, I mean, what do orchestral libraries go for now? I mean, you're easily spending $200, $300, $400 a pop. Save that money and give it to a local musician. Maybe it's even a college player who can come to your studio, mic them up. It doesn't have to be an expensive microphone, but by doing that, you're going to get a much more sort of interesting and unique sound than if you just bought the latest and greatest sample library that the company just came out with. So that's my rant over on working with live players, but I really just think it makes what we do so much more fulfilling. And I believe that the end result is better because of it as well. Anyways, let's move on. So the strings are following the harmonic progression here. Obviously, the parts are very simple. We just start off with just the violins on their own, kind of playing these swelling notes that are just following the harmonic progression alongside the piano. As the piece develops, we get the cello that enters and kind of the chord revoices a little bit. So here's what it sounds like a little further on in the piece. And then we have later on this section where the viola ends up taking a bit more of kind of a melody line. And another thing I want to point out here real quick is in this passage, this fourth chord that plays right here, that's something I love. I love to write it in when I can, but I also love to hear it in music that I'm listening to. And I think of it as like a passing dissonance. So a lot of times we think of dissonance, you know, these close notes that are right next to each other as this kind of like horror sound, this really ugly, tense sound. And it can definitely be that. But I also think in the right context, in these passages that are maybe a little less screechy horror, they still add this emotion, they add this depth. And in this case, to me, this chord here where we get this E and F right next to each other, but then it resolves, gives us that tension and release. And I kind of think of it when I hear that sort of semitone half step interval. For me, that's almost like, you know, when you have the knife in the heart, that's just the twisting of it. That's like really where you can feel pain in music. And I just love that sound. So I'll just play that passage again because why not? Awesome. And that takes us into the next section, which develops a little more. So now the cello and viola start to play a bit more of a arpeggiated figure, while the violins on top follow that same shape of the harmonic progression, but the notes are a bit more sort of marked and punctuated as opposed to really swelling in. So here's what that section sounds like. You can see that there are actually two passes of the strings. There's a section here and another pass here for that section. And basically what we did was actually split up the quartet and recorded it in two separate passes. So we did those chordal sort of harmonic lines with the violins up top, and then we did the arpeggiated figures with the viola and cello as a separate pass. And that gives us two sort of added benefits. First of all, it gives a little more flexibility in the mix. If I want to say push up those arpeggiated figures in the viola and cello, or maybe duck them back a little bit, it allows a little more flexibility there, because when you record everyone together, you know, they're all kind of bleeding into each other's microphones. But the other added benefit is, again, we only had one day to record all of the strings for the whole album. So we didn't have a lot of time. So it just gave a little more flexibility on the day to kind of workshop and really lock in the viola and cello together, get that part nailed, then lock in the violins up top, really get the intonation where we want it, get that part recorded without having to just stress about getting everything working all at once. And then we just kind of layer them all together. So this is probably the only instance on the album where we really did this and split it up. Otherwise, everything is just everybody playing together. But in this case, it really worked out to our advantage. So the other thing maybe worth highlighting here on the strings is this Studer tape emulation plugin. And what I'm doing here is something interesting, which I'll get into in a second. But when I was listening to the strings as I dropped them in, the multi-tracks, I wanted to maybe darken them a little bit and get a little more of a vintagey sound. I'm a huge fan of this sort of Nelson Riddle kind of 1950s classic orchestra sound. So I don't always want this really fizzy, sparkly, shiny sound. I like sometimes things to be a little more dark. If you can't tell, obviously with the Coles being my favorite microphones, there may be a trend here. But in this case, what I did is I did use this tape plugin for the tapey stuff that we all know and love, you know, a little bit of saturation, a little bit of sort of pitch, wow, and flutter to bring things to life. But the main thing I'm using it for is in this plugin, if you click open, you can open the device, which is hilarious. And there are these screws that are calibration screws. And what I did was just roll off a bit of the high frequency. So I'm essentially using it as an EQ to kind of just take off a little high frequency. Could I do that with just a separate EQ plugin? Definitely. But this worked. It was a sound I liked, and also combined things into one plugin, combined it with that tape sound. And sometimes when you can just find that knob that turns things at the right frequency that you're going for, then why bother looking for that elsewhere? But let's give it a listen. Maybe you'll hear the difference. I'll start with it off and then I'll turn it on. Piano twinkles are exactly what they sound like. It's me at the piano, sort of noodling with these very simple figures in the upper register just to kind of give a bit of twinkly movement to everything. So let's start off by listening to those, and then we'll kind of break down what it is that's actually making up this sound. Again, this is me just sitting at the piano, just playing these really simple figures and then kind of stacking them, panning them around, adding some delays. So just to show what they sound like, let me turn off the delays. And here's one of them on its own. Yeah, riveting stuff, I know. And the last thing to highlight on this group of instruments is if I actually open the automation, you can see here this yellow line is the volume of all of these groups together. So what I did is just kind of record and play and ride in the volume. So you can see at certain moments it swells up and it maybe comes a little forward. Maybe because the melody is a little bit more at rest, but then maybe it'll sit back to give space for the melody when it comes back in. And then we have it growing a little more at the end to take us into the next section. So that is something that was really important on this, because how annoying would it be if there's just this straight constant just da 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 in your ears? That would just drive me nuts. So having it swell in and out helps it feel a little more fresh and not so constant in the ear, but also just add a little bit of dynamics to everything. So let's talk about synthesizers. On this piece, there's actually only a couple synth elements, not a lot of synthesizers. We start off with this Juno 106, which is just doing, again, this arpeggiated figure following the harmonic progression. Here's what that sounds like. Later on, it grows a little bit in terms of the voicing of the chords. And the only other synth element in Bloom is just a simple sub bass, which I'm doing again with the Juno, but I put the chorus on it, and it's just playing the root notes of the chord. So it's very simple. Let's take a listen on its own. I know, this is riveting stuff. And it's just there to serve as the foundation, and a lot more rhythmic stuff and other things are happening on top. So the bass is just there to kind of hold things down. And if we listen to that in the mix, but the other thing that's happening there is I've also, just to fill out some more of the low end and add some of the real subby lows, is just added a sine wave an octave lower. So here's what that sounds like. And if you're listening on your phone or small speakers, you're probably not going to hear it, but here's what it sounds like. So that's the sound that's more kind of the rattle your windows sub low, but then we blend that with the Juno on top. I'm a sucker for a good mellotron sound. And the mellotron, if you don't know, is a keyboard instrument from, I believe, the 50s, maybe it was introduced. The classic example is Strawberry Fields Forever. One of my favorite examples is in Nights in White Satin. Nights in white satin, never reaching the end. I just love how it gives this hauntingly beautiful sound to everything. So let's listen to where the mellotron comes in. So there's the mellotron, primarily flutes, but also a little bit of the celeste. And in this later section, we get one of my favorite instruments on the mellotron, which is the bass clarinet. So you'll hear the bass clarinet paired with some of the choir from the mellotron, and again, some more celeste accents. How cool is that bass clarinet? I love the bass clarinet anyway, but on this mellotron, it just has such a just eerie but awesome sound. Let's listen to the bass clarinet on its own because we just have to. Oof, I love that. Part of the magic there too that I must admit is I've actually pitched it down an octave. So originally at pitch, this is what it sounds like. In the mellotron, you can actually slow down the tape and play it at a lower octave, but in this case I just added a pitch shifter to just bring it down an octave and bring it down here. This is the only instance of any kind of drum on the entire album. I don't know what it is, but for some reason, I tend just not to put a lot of drums or drum beats on my own original music releases. That said, Danny Carey, if you're listening, call me, my friend. Let's make it happen. In this case, we just have a simple kick drum sound. Very, very, very simple part. Just hitting those one accents on the one, and it's following the bass line and it's kind of accenting the bass line. Something maybe a little more interesting here is later on I bring in this kick that I call kick B, which is the same kick sound, but I just pitch it down one semitone to give it a little bit of a deeper tone, and then put a little bit of saturation and compression on it to just kind of fatten it up. And here's what that sounds like on its own. Finally, this brings us to a set of tracks that I have called background, which are basically sound designy, textural background elements. I don't often add a lot of these. In this case, there's still only a few, as you can see, but I think that's because it can sometimes be easy to rely on cymbal swells and noise sweeps to try to make things feel exciting and build excitement for the next section. And that's great. Cool to have those tools at our disposal. But I think there's something to be said about challenging ourselves to think about how can we have a piece get a sense of growth and development and anticipation in the actual music, in the harmony, in the notes that we choose, and not just rely on sound effects to get us from A to B. That said, let's bring on the hypocrisy while I show you. I do have this simple little riser, and it is simple. It is little, but it is just a little piano note that I hit, reverse it. It gives us a little rise into the next section. Here's what it sounds like on its own. Sounds like it's also going through maybe some pitch shifting and distortion. Here it is going in the mix to lead us into the next section. So just a little dash of ear candy. Then we have this thing here called Lake Fulmore Ambience. I will first show you what it sounds like on its own. What it is actually an iPhone just voice memo recording. One day I was out with my buddy Steven Salcido, who is right behind the camera right now, and we were doing a location scout for a project at Lake Fulmore in California. And I just kind of enjoyed the sound of the birds and the water and the trees. I thought it was a nice sound. Pulled out my iPhone, did a 10, 15, 20-second recording. Lucky for us, I found that original iPhone recording. Quite a big difference from where it ended up, right? As a reminder, it ended up here. Well, let me actually show you a little bit of the process that went into kind of making that. And just a fun production trick when you do take some field noise recordings or any kind of sounds that you have, some things you can do. With any kind of noise, you can actually bring out pitches, especially if there's a lot of dense frequency material. You can kind of easily find and bring out actual notes from these. So in this case, let's say I pull out an EQ, and if I go to like an A here, let's go to an octave up. Let's go to the A, 880 hertz. And if I just crank the Q, so we get this really narrow notch in the EQ and just boost it way up. You can start to hear a little bit of a whistling sound. Let me boost it even more. Now you're really getting it. And then maybe what I'll do is go an octave up and do that again. So we're kind of building out a little bit of the harmonic series. So I'll do that just an octave up. So this is another A that I'm boosting. Now you're really starting to hear that whistling. And then maybe what I'll do is even go a fifth up from that, which, not to get too nerdy on you, but basically following the natural harmonic series that occurs in nature. So if we go a fifth up from that, now we're starting to put in some overtones. And for good fun, for good measure, maybe let's go another octave up. So let's add another note here. And that's what's fun about this FabFilter Pro Q that I'm using, is you have this little keyboard here, which makes it easy to select frequencies that align with specific notes. So if I boost this one up again. Last, let's just chop off some of the bottom so we take out some of that rumbly noise. And then what I'll do is bounce that in place. So we now have that printed to a new file. We can just delete the original. So we have this whistly kind of tonality that's brought out of that iPhone recording. What that allows me to do is just drag that simple audio file into a sampler. And now by dropping it into the sampler, that allows me to actually play this single audio file across the keyboard and play, for example, chords. Which is already kind of cool, but what good would a background ambient texture be without a ton of reverb? So if I just bring on a Pro R, I'll just crank that up a little bit. So that's a bit of the process that went into it, just as a fun aside. I did get a bit down a rabbit hole here. And the final little element maybe to point out here is at the end, which is just a good old fashioned tape delay feedback self-oscillation effect. It's a classic trick, but it's one that I love when appropriate. And in this case, I'm using it to kind of finalize the piece, give a sense of going somewhere, and take us into the next track on the album. So it kind of ties over to the following track. So that's Bloom, and a little bit of what went into the writing and the production and mixing of the piece. If you're still sticking with me this far into the video, first of all, give yourself a pat on the back. Consider yourself one of the rare few who actually watch videos on the internet for longer than 5-second clips at a time. And if you want to listen to Bloom, it's on my new album Landscapes, which is out right now. It's available anywhere you listen to music. So Spotify, Apple, Tidal, YouTube, and thanks for hanging out with me.